Hi Year 3, so it's now time for our story and we're going to carry on reading James and the Giant Peach. Now in the previous chapter that we read yesterday, James's evil aunties have locked him outside again and they've said that he has to clean up all the mess that the crowds have left behind. They're being quite unkind to him again. And so James goes for a wander and comes across the Giant Peach. As he stood gazing at it and looking at it, he discovers a mysterious hole in the side of the peach. So we're going to read chapter 10 and 11 now to see if we can find out what happens next. So, chapter 10. It was quite a large hole, the sort of thing an animal the size of a fox might have made. James knelt down in front of it and poked his head and shoulders inside. He crawled in. He kept on crawling. This isn't a hole, he thought excitedly. It's a tunnel. The tunnel was damp and murky, and all around him there was a curious, bittersweet smell of fresh peach. The floor was soggy under his knees, the walls were wet and sticky, and the peach juice was dripping down from the ceiling. James opened his mouth and caught some of it on his tongue. It tasted delicious. He was crawling uphill now, as though the tunnel were leading straight towards the very centre of the gigantic fruit. Every few seconds he paused and took a bite out of the wall. The peach flesh was sweet and juicy and marvellously refreshing. He crawled on for several more yards and then suddenly, bang! The top of his head bumped into something extremely hard, blocking his way. He glanced up. In front of him there was a solid wall that seemed at first as though it were made of wood. He touched it with his fingers. It certainly felt like wood, except that it was jagged and full of deep grooves. Good heavens, he said, I know what this is. I've come to the stone in the middle of the peach. Then he noticed that there was a small door cut into the face of the peach stone. He gave it a push. It swung open. He crawled through it, and before he had time to glance up and see where he was, he heard a voice saying, Look who's here. And the other one said, We've been waiting for you. James stopped and stared at the speakers, his face white with horror. He started to stand up, but his knees were shaking so much he had to sit down again on the floor. He glanced behind him, thinking he could bolt back into the tunnel the way he had come, but the doorway had disappeared. There was now only a solid brown wall behind him. James's large frightened eyes travelled slowly round the room. The creatures, some sitting on chairs, others reclining on a sofa, were all watching him intently. Creatures? Or were they insects? An insect is something usually rather small, is it not? A grasshopper, for example, is an insect. So what would you call it if you saw a grasshopper as large as a dog? As large as a large dog? You could hardly call that an insect, could you? There was an old green grasshopper as large as a large dog sitting directly across the room from James now. And next to the old green grasshopper there was an enormous spider. And next to the spider there was a giant ladybug with 9 black spots on her scarlet shell. Each of these 3 was squatting upon a magnificent chair. On a sofa nearby, reclining comfortably in a curled up position, there was a centipede and an earthworm. On the floor over in the far corner, there was something thick and white that looked as though it might be a silkworm, but it was sleeping soundly and nobody was paying any attention to it. Every one of these creatures was at least as big as James himself, and in the strange greenish light that shone down from somewhere in the ceiling, they were absolutely terrifying. I'm hungry, the spider announced suddenly, staring hard at James. I'm famished, the old green grasshopper said. So am I, the ladybird cried. The centipede sat up a little straighter on the end of the sofa. Everyone's famished, he said. We need food. Oh dear. 4 pairs of round, black, glossy eyes were all fixed upon James. The centipede made a wriggling movement with his body as though he were about to glide off the sofa, but he didn't. There was a long pause and a long silence. The spider, who happened to be a female spider, opened her mouth and ran a long black tongue delicately over her lips. Aren't you hungry? she asked suddenly, leaning forward and addressing herself to James. Poor James was backed up against the far wall, shivering with fright and much too terrified to answer. "What's the matter with you?" the green old grasshopper asked. "You look positively ill." "He looks as though he's going to faint any second," the centipede said. "Oh my goodness, the poor thing!" the ladybird cried. "I do believe he thinks it's him that we're wanting to eat." There was a roar of laughter from all sides. Oh dear, they said. "What an awful thought!" "You mustn't be frightened," the ladybird said kindly. "We wouldn't dream of hurting you. You are one of us now. Didn't you know that? You are one of the crew. We're all in the same boat." "We've been waiting for you all day long," the old green grasshopper said. "We thought you were never going to turn up, but I'm glad you made it. So cheer up, my boy, cheer up," the centipede said. "And meanwhile, I wish you'd come over here and give me a hand with these boots. It'll take me hours to get them all off by myself." So in those two chapters, in 10 and 11, it sounds like James has met some new friends, doesn't it? Well, they're being kind to him at the minute. So we will carry on reading chapter 12 tomorrow and find out what happens next with James and his new friends that he's met. Bye for now, Year 3.